All right, everyone, I think we can get started. Thank you all so much for being here today to hear from Dr. Mamta Nagaraja a little bit about her. She is currently the NASA Associate Chief Scientist for Exploration and Applied Research in the Office of the Chief Scientist. In this role, she advises the chief scientist in the areas of exploration and biomedical and physical sciences performed by humans in space. Her research expertise is on the molecular effects of microgravity on bone cells. Additionally, Dr. Nagaraja has previously served as a program scientist for space biology, led science communications, served as the lead mechanical engineer for a scientific instrument, trained astronauts for their missions in space, and worked in the Mission Control Center. One of her most coveted recognitions was getting an interview to become a NASA astronaut. She learned the most about how to succeed after failing twice to achieve this dream. Lastly, Dr. Nagaraja is passionate about increasing diversity and inclusivity in science, and she loves mentoring others to help them find their best career pathway. She lives in the Washington, D.C. metro area with her husband and 3 children. Dr. Nagaraja is a bilingual first-generation American and first-generation college graduate from an immigrant family with 5 kids and dedicated, selfless parents. We are so grateful to have you here speak with us for an ASGSR Students webinar. Dr. Nagaraja, please take it away. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the intro, and also just a heads up that I'm starting to lose my voice. So if I sound like a news anchor, that is why. But thank you so much for having me, for that kind introduction. And I'm honored to be here to share my story. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen before we get started. And whenever we do get to questions, you are all welcome to call me Mamta. Let's see. Anna, can you just confirm that you can see my slides?
Yep.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I thought you really got to hear a lot of my story right there in my bio, but I thought I'd give you just a little bit of a sense of where I thought I was going and then where I ended up, because it never looks the way, in my opinion, that we dream it to be when we are the tiny little girl that's on this slide. So I think I would venture a guess that I am not the only person in this virtual room who dreamed to be that person right there in the middle, kind of hiding in the truss of the International Space Station. That was certainly my dream when I was little, and I will venture to say that it's still my dream to be that person. And so that was sort of what drove me on my own journey. And I imagine that many of you have either had the opportunity to send your own science. I know a couple of you have, to the International Space Station, or would dream to be there someday. And so this was definitely the vehicle that I thought I would get to stay on. I don't know that that will happen for me, but I still have a dream to eventually get into space and look down and see our beautiful planet. So I think this is part of what drives me even still today. And if I can't ever get myself into space, I think I'll do just fine spending the rest of my career learning more about this planet, learning how we can leave it in a better place for the future. And as I've become a parent, that seems to be more paramount in my journey than it ever was before. So as I went on this adventure to figure out how I was going to achieve this dream, it led me to graduate school. I studied aerospace engineering at Texas A&M in undergraduate school because obviously I had this extreme love for vehicles that had to soar through the air or travel in the air. And I really loved my aerospace engineering background. But sometime over the course and towards the end of that journey, I became really interested in the human body. I had influences around me that really drove me to think about how incredible this system was. It's almost as if somebody had engineered it, though we know that it wasn't, that it is a natural thing. But the way that the entire body works as a system was so fascinating to the engineering side of me. And so as I went down this pathway to see if there was any way to mend together these two loves, this desire to go into space and the study of the human body. I came across a field that all of you are very familiar with today, but back when I was entering it was fairly new, and that's biomedical engineering and this whole notion of aerospace medicine. Um, so I'm not going to go into details about this research. I put it on here just so you can sort of see. And I know many of you are in the throes of doing this exact kind of scientific research. And so that's really what I had used to start my pathway into the job that I hoped I would have. And you'll soon learn it is not the job that I actually have. So after getting my PhD from Georgia Tech in biomedical engineering, I sought after a job to keep doing that work. I actually wanted to be at the bench and I wanted to study the bodies of these people right here in space in an extreme environment. My research was in bone loss. That's what you were looking at before, molecular markers of bone loss. And it turned out, for those of you who know a little bit of history of what's now called the Biological and Physical Sciences Group, or BPS at NASA, right when I got into the field was when NASA's budget in that field was at its highest, almost $500 million. And through the course of my PhD, somewhere in there, I remember my professor could not keep getting NASA funding. And I don't remember the nuances of it. I was a little too young and green to know what he was trying to tell me. But all I know is at some point, I continued my same research, but we talked about it differently. And it turned out, as I reflect, that he had found NIH funding to keep me going. And so we started talking about it from a health perspective versus a space perspective. And that's because the funding had been slashed at NASA to what it's almost just slightly lower than what it is current day, which is about 80 million. So from $500 million to about 80 or $90 million today. And so by the time I went to get a job, there were none in that field that would keep me at the bench. So I took my consolation prize, which looking back was a pretty fun consolation prize. And I trained these guys to go up on their missions using this US Space Shuttle at the time. And so I got to see the US Space Shuttle to retire, sent them to the International Space Station. I trained them, and it was pretty cool experience, I have to say, especially coming right out of school. And then I also worked their missions in mission control. This is the one of the only two pictures I have of me in mission control. And I'm so glad that the photographers captured these moments because I had not really thought of it as a picture-esque moment. But as you get older and you reflect back on your career, you realize the moments that have the most impact in who you become and how your career journey progresses. And so I think working in the Mission Control Center was one of the greatest opportunities I had. It put me in a high stress, high stakes, high risk environment, and really forced me to perform at a level I had never performed at before. And many of the skills that it requires to do that sort of work, decision making, critical decision making in a fast amount of time with high risks. I mean, those are things that I still use today. And I think they're skills that are used widely in and out of space exploration. So, not a bad consolation prize if I reflect back and think on it that way. And then I got my chance. I actually got my chance. And if I were to give anyone advice today on how to become an astronaut, it would not be the pathway that I took. So, more on that if there are questions later. But here I am in one of the medical exams that they do when you get a chance, when you go through the interview process. But I got my chance not once, but twice. And I didn't get it either time. That was definitely, from a career perspective, the low in my life. It is where I really had to dig deep, find a way to get past it, figure out how to dream again, figure out if I was giving up on my dream. Spoiler alert, I applied again at the current one, so I didn't give up on it. But man, did I want to. And the opportunities to become an astronaut are so different in today's age and in the era where you would be applying, because I imagine some of you will apply, than it was back in the space shuttle era. So things are just so different, and it's very difficult to find that joy again, to find that will to persevere. But I guess that's when it's your passion that becomes a little bit easier. So it definitely didn't take much for me to put my name back in the hat. So we'll see as the year progresses. But in coming out of that, moment in my career, I realized through the help of mentors and really good supervisors that there were other ways to contribute to the mission. And I think this was one of the coolest opportunities I got. And it's certainly not what you think of when you think of NASA, but this is looking up at the 2017 total solar eclipse. And I'm in DC here, which was not along the path of totality. So I didn't get to see the full eclipse. And the reason is I was setting up infrastructure and innovating an entire new way to see eclipses. In 2017, it had been almost a century since our country got to view it, meaning that almost nobody living had gotten to see the one 99 years before that. And we were in the digital age. So my boss said, your job is to set up an infrastructure. So on the day that the eclipse is streamed live, which you're going to do, the internet doesn't break. And everyone thought she had lost it. Nobody thought that the internet was going to break because of the eclipse. Nobody had the vision that she had, but somehow I bought into it. It seemed to make sense that this was going to be widely popular. And I have to tell you, everyone looks back and says, she was right. What we did that day ended up setting a record at NASA and records even beyond NASA. 65 million people tuned in online at a single time, and the internet didn't break, but we had made a lot of infrastructure decisions to be sure that that didn't happen, including talking to Amazon directly to make sure nobody touched their servers on that day at that time. And we were able to convince them that this was something that was going to be unprecedented. It is still the largest event that NASA has ever streamed online. More people watched this than a rover landing on Mars. And if you combine it with the number of people that went to in-person NASA events, this is my favorite factoid. More people watched the eclipse on that day than watched the more people watched the eclipse that day than watched the Super Bowl that year, which I think is pretty phenomenal. I think most of us in this room love science, and to see people in our country come together to experience something this phenomenal is pretty great. It was a fun thing to work, and it was a nice way to come out of a big failure in my life. Just a smattering of some of the other things that remind me that we can dream big. And just because you fail at one dream doesn't mean there aren't other wonderful things that you can do. From getting to work very closely during the Obama administration with the White House Council to seeing my own total solar eclipse in April this year. And I got to take my kids being a scientist on a mission to the moon, which is Laddie. You see the drawing of it down below. Designing an instrument to go to Venus, which I never thought I would get to do, and being part of the team that put Perseverance on Mars. Definitely have gotten to do some cool things despite big failures. And then, of course, leading me to my current job, which I didn't even know existed, and is a great place to be. I would have never known that this was a pathway that I could have taken. And so that leads me into my very last slide. If you pay attention to nothing else or did not pay attention to anything else, I hope you will listen to this and grab the link that is at the bottom of this website. This is sciencecareers.apps.nasa.gov. For those who maybe cannot see it, is the link to NASA Science Careers. And it's a really great website to just kind of tinker with and click around. Somebody took this daunting effort to put down all of the various ways that you can get through the NASA system on a scientist pathway, from research scientists, which you see I captured here, to program scientists, to other types of bench science, to all the various fields of science, because science is not just the life sciences, which we're the life or physical sciences, which we're most familiar with, but astrophysics, heliophysics, all the different sciences. And it not only will give you the pathway, but it actually will give you roles that may have led you there, and then career growth that it could lead to. And then it also, if you were to look at the actual website, tells you, you can see down here, skills and competencies and training that you can take to get there. I just think it's a wealth of resource for those of you who are very driven and are hoping to get a job at NASA or in the space industry. While it may not be exact for our commercial partners, it gives you an idea of some of the ways that you could be qualified for those jobs. And I think I'm stopping there, and I'm happy to answer any questions, Anna. So I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you, Mamta. That was so insightful. Um, Folks, feel free to drop questions. There's a Q&A option available. There's also the webinar chat. You can see your questions through that avenue as well. While people are brainstorming, I'm curious about hearing more about what you learned from applying to and interviewing to become an astronaut. What did that process look like? And what are your takeaways from it?
Yeah, so I can't get into the details of exactly what the interview process is like because we all sign NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements for that. But I can talk large and big picture about it. Um, so a couple of things that I learned. The first one, which I kind of alluded to when I was going through the slides, and I think is most useful to any of you who are hoping to apply in the future. Um, at least when I was a little girl, I thought the easiest and the best pathway to become an astronaut would be to get to NASA. And so my whole adventure in life was to get myself to NASA. But it turns out when I went through the interview process and I started looking at the data of past astronauts, and some of you may have already been smart enough to do this. I was not at the time, nor do I think I had the internet to give me that resource. And so I was going off of what I thought. It is not, most of our astronauts do not come from NASA. Most of them come from outside entities. So, for example, people who interviewed with me, there was a medical doctor who treated Aborigines in Australia. That was his big thing. There was somebody who built underwater dams. Like he was literally an engineer who went underwater and built dams underwater. I mean, it makes perfect sense why he would have been somebody who was on their list because he's already showing he can work in an extreme environment and he can build underwater. I mean, this is how the astronauts train. It is one of the most likely um, scenarios that you could be in on Earth that could simulate being out in space. I mean, so things like that, but most of them don't come from NASA. So that was my first big takeaway. And those who do come from NASA come from the flight surgeon group or the pilots. But it's a very, very small group. It is actually really difficult to get an interview when you're a NASA employee. They tend to come from the outside. And I understand that being older now, Anna, it's you want a wide perspective in this group of people who are doing some of the hardest work that NASA's been charged to do. And if you pick from internally, then you're very insular. So they want these outside perspectives. So that was the first thing I learned. The second one was from Dwayne Ross, and some of you may know him or possibly recognize his name. He was the one who led all of the selections of the 30 years that we had the space shuttle. And so he had seen many people succeed and he had seen more fail at their quest to become an astronaut. And he gave me this advice when I was about your age. And he said, don't do anything just to become an astronaut. Follow your interests. And if they lead you to becoming an astronaut, wonderful. But he told me I have seen it ruin people's lives. And now that I'm older, I can see exactly why he gave me that advice when I was 19, 20 years old. So those are probably the two things that I learned the most going through it.
Thank you, Mamta. Folks, you can also raise your hand if you'd like to ask your question directly. Maybe make this a little bit more interactive so she gets to talk to someone other than just me. But in the meantime, let's see. Isaiah had a question. He's also currently working on human bone cells and the effects of simulated microgravity on bone cells in vitro. What kind of career options should he be looking for in the niche field of space science if he wants to stay at the bench?
Yeah, Isaiah, that's a good question. So, yeah, I talked a little bit about the budget woes at NASA, and that's just real. We're going to have to deal with that. It's been like that. There are organizations just like ASGSR being at the top of that list that are trying to increase the funding so that there's more bench science in our field. But let's just assume for the moment that the budget we have is the budget we're going to have for the foreseeable future. So then I think your best options are a few different things. Academia, if that's the life that you think would work best for your career journey. Academia is a very different place than it used to be. I do think you could get funding. If it's not through NASA, you may consider the NIH type of funding and talking about how the research in space can be used to help and benefit those on Earth. That whole link between benefiting Earth and space research has become even stronger in modern day We try to make that very well known. We partner with the NIH, we partner with FDA, we partner with all sorts of agencies because there is a direct benefit to people on Earth from the science that we do in space exploration. So I think you have multiple options: NSF, NIH, NASA, rather than just NASA, which makes bench science a little bit more palatable. It's not always the answer you'll get from other academics because they're used to applying for NASA funding, and NASA funding kind of stinks right now. But I think you just have to like look more broadly at it. I think you can still do bench science. You just have to be able to kind of talk about it in more broad sense and maybe directly about Earth benefits and how it can work. If you haven't heard about Space Tango and shoot, Anna, do you remember the Lambda Vision? Lambda Vision and Space Tango is a great example of they're making a retina in space that could be used for macular degeneration, but look them up and they kind of, I think theirs is an example of how you could easily talk about macular degeneration, which affects tens of millions of people here on Earth, and why it's so useful to do in space. So that's an example of how you can sort of marry the two together and apply for funding outside of NASA. So academia, I do think that there's opportunities at NASA. Maybe not. There are some bench science positions, but if you can't get one of those, there are other ways, like my job, that you can still be near the field of ASGSR, so physical and space life sciences, in microgravity, but you wouldn't be as close as the bench science. So you have to decide what you want to do. So there's program science, project science, things of that nature that could get you there, not just at NASA, but by the time you get to your jobs, you're going to have the options of the five or so orbital, like the orbiting space stations that the commercial space groups are going to have. So I think you'll have multiple groups. They're just starting up with they've all hired their chief scientist, but that chief scientist is going to need multiple scientists under them to build a program of science to be done in LEO, in the commercial world. So I think you should look out for those too.
Thank you, Mamta. Soraya also has a question. He writes in, great talk, Mamta. I was wondering how often you find yourself working with and coordinating with individuals at other space agencies, for example, the European Space Agency, JAXA, etc. How do you see that changing as we transition from the ISS to a commercial space station?
Yeah, a lot. In terms of your first question, working with our other partner agencies, I just got back from the Canadian Space Agency, where we pulled together most of the other space agencies, either virtually or in person in the room. In fact, I would venture to say all of the major space agencies were represented. And this was the International Space Life Sciences Working Group. So right in our field here that's of interest. And we pulled ourselves together, number one, to find and build relationships so we can partner in the future. So how can, for example, ESA talked about how they're doing this huge hackathon in Europe, but they're using NASA's database, the Gene Lab, for it, which I thought was just a beautiful way to marry the different space science data that we get among the countries that are in space exploration. So that's like an example of why we would get together. We discuss the big ticket items that maybe people need to work through. For example, you might have someone trying to battle the difficulties of sending rodents to space, which can be a cumbersome job. And then working with other agencies who have maybe figured it out a little bit better or have other types of capabilities that we may not have. And so partnering together on those rather than reinventing them is a much better path forward. So yes, to working with other space agencies. How is that going to change in the commercial world? I think there will still be an international component because those space agencies are going to need a pathway to get on the commercial platforms. If they're investing themselves in low Earth orbit research, which they are, and they have, it seems, no desire to taper that research. So they're going to need somewhere to put that research in the future. So right now, what we're talking about in small groups is what is the future of LEO going to look like, and what is NASA's role in there, and how are we going to make sure that our partner agencies in the US, as well as our international partners, are going to have pathways to getting to these commercial companies. So there's the business to business, where you just tell the partners, go talk directly to the company. And then there's going to be other pathways, we hope, through the US government, perhaps with some sort of subsidy in there as well, to work with us as well, where the advantage might be palatable for them. So I think you're going to find that we're still going to work with our partners, but there'll be an increase in working with our our international partners, and an increase in working with our commercial partners as well.
Thank you. Some deep, right, very inspiring journey. Thank you for sharing. In your opinion, what areas of science are in high demand at this time? And what advice would you give a high schooler? And what should they be focusing on right now?
Ooh, so okay, what areas of science are in high demand? I would actually tell you that each of the main areas of, I'm going to say space science, because those are the sciences that we would be interested in, are, I wouldn't say equally in demand, but they are all there and they all have healthy budgets. They all have more budget than BPS does, to be honest with you. From astrophysics to heliophysics, studying the relationship between the sun and the earth, studying our own planet. I mean, if we cut funding to studying our own planet, we are in big trouble as a nation and as a world. So I think you're only going to see earth sciences increase. And remember, earth science isn't just studying our planet here from Earth, but also being able to observe it from space. So that's the robotic missions that get sent up. But then there's also so many instruments that are put on the International Space Station. Some of those need human interaction to move them from one location to another. So you get a different vantage point of the Earth. But I think all of the various sciences have their place in NASA's budget, but also outside of NASA's budget. I think there's a lot of interest from different areas in being able to perform those sciences. So all that to say, I don't know that I would pick out a particular science. If you're a high schooler and you are trying to decide which area do I want to pursue, I would say, similar to what Dwayne Ross told me, pick the area that interests you the most. One, you're going to enjoy college way more if you're interested in it. Don't be afraid to change if you start in college and you're like, man, I do not like this. Because look, my first semester, I was a chemical engineer because I loved chemistry. And it turns out chemical engineering is not chemistry. It's all about building plants. And I didn't want to build plants. So I changed. So don't be afraid to change and get into the thing that interests you the most. For me, that was air and space. That led me to aerospace engineering. So I'd say to any high schooler, pick the field of science that when you read about it or you hear about it or you listen to somebody tell you about it, you go, oh, that's interesting. Whatever causes that spark in your brain is the one I would tell you to pursue.
Thank you. Alan has a question saying he's writing in, thank you so much for the talk. Is the NASA postdoc program a good career pathway to be a future astronaut? Who provides funding for the NASA postdoc program?
Very good question. So the NASA postdoctoral program is funded by the Science Mission Directorate at NASA. Is it a good pathway to becoming an astronaut? I don't know. I think we've had maybe one or two, so not that many have made it to astronaut, but I don't think that's a reason to say it's not a good pathway. So I'll tell you why. I think your scientist astronauts are only going to increase in the era where you will be applying for astronaut. I think science is largely becoming more and more of a focus because we've had lots of strong advocates out on Capitol Hill telling Congress to increase funding for science. And then the agency, within the agency, you have had many strong advocates. You're listening to one right now, telling agency leaders, look, this is why science is important. We build the vehicle, but we don't just build it for fun. We don't build it to build it. We build it to do science. And that's really been, it's been an internal struggle for many, but we are being heard. Let me put it that way. So I think your scientist astronaut opportunities are only going to increase as we continue. And if you look at the recent selections, there have been an uptick in the number of pure scientists that have been chosen. There's also been an uptick in the number of military who have been chosen. So either pathway could lead you to astronaut. But I would go back to what Dwayne told me, and that is, if you love the bench, I mean, you love the bench, and let's say you don't want to go through the academic lifestyle of working at a university, man, I would go for that NASA postdoc. It is a good way to stay at the bench. You get paid fairly reasonably well compared to other peers with postdocs. You work in a cool place. I mean, the mission at NASA, I know I don't have to tell this group how absolutely inspiring it is. I mean, 20 years into it, and I still am inspired by the things that we do. And I mean, sometimes I'm shocked by the things that we accomplish because I know how the sausage is made, so they speak. But it is an unbelievable place to work. I mean, truly is. So if you are interested in the bench, you're interested in being a government scientist, and you love NASA's mission, I say apply for it. Don't worry about the astronaut piece until it's your turn to apply. It's the astronaut selection process is all about how you sell yourself. And it's not just about your career, but it's going to be some of those hobbies and those things that you do outside of work that'll land you an interview.
Could you speak a little bit more about, the extra non-career types of hobbies that,
Mhm.
you would either suggest or people generally tend to have? Not that we should
Yeah.
be changing our hobbies just for that, but what are your sort of insights on that?
Yeah, I'll tell you a quick anecdote. So when I first applied, I mean, I don't even know if they read my application. I'm not gonna lie to you, Anna, because I didn't get any hint or any signs that it made it through any filter whatsoever. And I remember that was coming out of my PhD. So I was young, maybe a little cocky, and I remember thinking, "Oh, I cannot believe NASA's not interested in me." I remember thinking this at, like, age 26, 27. And luckily, when the second opportunity came, which are about 4 years in between now, Leland Melvin, if you don't know him, look him up. He was from the shuttle era, one of the coolest guys I've ever met, was at that time in Washington, D.C., leading the Office of STEM Engagement, it's called today. And a mentor of mine put me in touch with him. And I remember I was skiing in the mountains of Utah, I think. And it was 2 days before applications were due. And I, in my cocky frame of mind, was like, I am not applying. I was bitter. I was mad. I was like, I'm not applying again. If NASA doesn't want me, then I don't want them. That was sort of my attitude at that time. And he called me while I'm in the mountains with a breaky cell coverage, and he just talked me through something. And at the end of that call, I remember thinking, oh, and this is what he told me. He said, "What are you doing right now?" And I said, "I'm skiing." And he said, "Put that on your application. What else do you like to do?" And I told him the different things that I like to do. He goes, "Put that on your application." And then he walked me through the thought process. So things like skiing, that's an adventurous activity. If you are into adventure, then you're probably going to be okay putting yourself on millions of pounds of fuel and lighting it on fire, right? That sort of mentality. So he had to really kind of just change my frame of mind and say, and I told him, I said, I jumped out of a plane once, and I remember he laughed. He goes, "Mamta, put that on your application. Going skydiving is one of the hardest things that people will do. It's one of the scariest things. I learned how to pilot an aircraft. Put that on your application." I mean, I just started telling him some of the things I like to do. And he said, "Put it on your application each time." Climbing, if you do rock climbing, like the rock climbing gyms, you don't even have to go climb actual rocks. Whether you're harnessed or not, it doesn't matter. What they're looking for is this person going to be comfortable when we strap them onto a rocket and send them into space? Are they going to be able to keep their cool? Or are they going to completely freeze up? Are they okay being in confined spaces? Does that make you really nervous? These are things you will have to be real with yourself about. If those are things you cannot see yourself in, situations that make your heart go faster now, then it's going to be really hard to try to do that in a real world scenario when help is not a phone call away. So that's sort of the mentality that he put me in so that I could reframe it. So hobbies and interests, things like, I'll give you some less adventurous ones too before we go to the next question. So we know astronauts are going to have to learn how to grow their own food in space when we're in a more sustained sort of exploration period. So do you have a green thumb? Do you really and truly enjoy growing plants? Do you like experimenting with different kinds of plants? I mean, things like that. So sort of start to look at what you like to do and think more broadly about them. Does this have a place for the future of space exploration? And try to think to the future. Don't think about the right now, but where should we be going if everything goes well? So that's the advice I'd give you.
Thank you. That was so interesting. I've never even thought about adventurous hobbies, but also things like gardening or plants having a role, but that makes a lot of sense. Um, Folks, feel free to drop questions in the chat as you'd like. Otherwise, I'll just keep rambling. I'm interested in You talked a lot about budgeting for, for example, for BPS, how it's dropped in recent years. Do you think the commercial spaceflight industry will start to supplement those drops in funding? I know, for example, SpaceX recently opened a round of proposals and grants for biological related research, but usually they haven't done that in the past. How do you think that landscape is going to change in the future?
Yeah, I'll preface this by saying I don't actually know. So I'm speculating. Let's call it as Mamta versus a chief scientist, an associate chief scientist. Um, yes, so I saw the same thing with SpaceX that you did. I don't think you're going to see it. I was surprised that theirs came out now. Um, I I don't think you're going to see as many calls now, but I do think we'll see an uptick in calls as we get closer to the end of the decade and the first the first commercial pieces go up into space, whoever they may be, whoever that may be of the 5 or 6 companies that are right now investing in a future orbital platform that goes out into space. I think as they build, so right now we know that they have chief scientists, they might even have a small team of people trying to set up their future space stations. But as that starts to grow and they actually have a plan and they actually know what capabilities they're going to provide, which most of them have a list of those capabilities that they plan to provide, and they get a sense of what the users would want, which we've also talked to them about already, then I think you'll start seeing them implement their entire program that they've designed. And part of that implementation, I suspect, will be soliciting proposals themselves. I think that'll be one pathway. And then you'll have the pathway through the government. I don't see a world in which the government doesn't have its own pathway because NASA is going to be such a large user of these platforms. You'll have the pathway for the government also, and then I think you'll have a pathway for partners, both commercial and and international partners also. So yeah, I do think there'll be multiple pathways. Now, your ultimate question, do I think that's like going to increase the overall funding that's available to scientists? Maybe. I'm not completely sure. The budget is so convoluted and complicated. It's hard to really know. I suspect though that the budget we have right now at BPS isn't going to go down. I mean, it's already low. I don't know anyone who's looking to decrease it. What we're trying to do is increase it, right? I know, cross fingers that it goes up, but I don't sense that it would go down. So I think theoretically, any money your private companies put into it would augment on the upside. I think it would supplement it. That's my best guess, though. But it is all speculation and guess. Like I don't have any insider information on that.
Yeah, very fair. Hopefully BPS funding doesn't continue to decrease just in time for, me to hit the job market.
I don't suspect that it will decrease. I just hope that it will increase. But I don't think any of us have reason to believe that it would go down.
Very fair. Um,
Yeah.
Folks, if something popped up in your screen, that's just a poll from us. There's 3 simple questions. Feel free to answer it if you'd like. In the meantime, we'll keep taking questions. This is from Sanjay. They write, do you think there will be research funding coming out from private entities, for example, SpaceX or Blue Origin?
Yeah, so you're already starting to see this with SpaceX, but I think you'll see an uptick in it as we get closer to these commercial platforms being actually set up in space, which is supposed to start. I mean, the earliest one has said 2025. I suspect it'll be a little bit later than that. 2028 has been another date the commercial companies have thrown out there as when they think their platform will be ready and in space. The space station, we have it going until 2030. The goal is to have at least one of those commercial entities out in space before 2030 so we can have a clean transition over. But as you start to see these dates coming 2025, 2028, 2030, I think you'll see an uptick in solicitations. I don't know for certain, Sanjay, but I suspect that our private companies will also have their own, similar to what SpaceX put out recently.
And then a follow-up question, do you think they will expand into the physical science and engineering as well? As of right now, it seems to be mostly human science and biological sciences.
Yes, you're going to see increase in the physics, long history, internal stuff about why physics has not had recent or as many solicitations. boils down to they were building a lot of hardware. So a lot of the funding was going to building hardware. But you will see a change in NASA solicitations in physics. They're going to go up in the next, you'll see it this year sometime. So there will be more solicitations to harness physical science experiments. The space biology were continuous over those years because they were managed by different people, and they had those leaders, program scientists, had different frames of mind and thought processes versus your physical science teams. But we've got a new leader in town who I know is going to push through the physical sciences to get more solicitations out there. So you will start seeing it from the NASA end. I suspect the commercial companies will follow suit because hopefully if the vision is laid out and implemented the way it's been laid out, once NASA does it and the benefits start coming back to Earth and we start understanding that research, much like we do on the life sciences side, you'll see other entities also follow suit and pursue their own studies of physical sciences.
Cool, thank you. This is a question from Isaiah. Could you explain more about the effects of microgravity on bone loss? Subject very near and dear to my heart, Isaiah. I do the same research.
I missed the last part. The effects of microgravity on bone. On bone, yeah. Yes. So largely, this is probably the one that we understand the best. And it's the one that I would say scientists figured out early on from the beginning, bone and muscle. So the skeletal muscular effects of microgravity. So what we know is the astronauts will come back with less bone mass than they had going in. And it's mostly in the hip, the wrists, and the lower spine is where we see the majority of that bone loss, which if you understand how the body is weight bearing, then that makes sense. That's where we bear a lot of our weight, or the parts of our body that are used so frequently in order for mobility. We know that the muscles that are in the body are also atrophied, and it doesn't matter what kind of muscle, from muscles that help our legs move to the heart to lungs, everything gets atrophied in space. We know a lot of that can be counteracted with exercise and conditioning that you get through exercise, both in some sort of weight bearing, which we use elastic for, but also in a cardiovascular way, which is the adapted treadmill also. But we know that it's not perfect and it doesn't counteract it well enough. So it remains one of the top 5 risks, I think the Human Research Program calls it. So it is still one of the top risks. And the big concern is we go off to Mars. We know they're going to lose some of their bone mass and bone density is going to go down. And they would be fine until one of them has a fall. And it's really the fall, much like osteoporotic patients here on Earth. You can lose bone mass, and if you never get a DEXA scan, then you wouldn't know until you fall and you break a bone, and then they do the scans on you and they go, oh, well, look at your bone. There's none there. So it's really going to be when they have a fall. And then how are we going to help them when you can't just call 911? There's no medical facilities, of course, that far away, which is also, by the way, all of this thought process is what ended up with an increase in the selection of medical doctors. Is we need to have some sort of medical capabilities available to our astronauts on these more sustained missions that we envision for the future. So we know that that's what's happening. What we don't know is really the molecular mechanisms. There are a lot of mechanisms that have been studied, and I would encourage you, if this is not your field, then to join up with somebody whose field this is, to sort of help walk you through some of those mechanisms. But if it is your field, definitely doing some research into the particular molecules that have been shown to be as part of the signaling mechanisms. That was part of what I was doing with looking at bone morphogenic proteins with BMP4 and BMP2. BMP2 is widely known as a bone morphogenic protein, but BMP4 was less known. It's actually found in atherosclerosis, the calcium deposits forming in our heart vessels, which is what my professor was studying. And it's not as well documented in its mechanisms in bones. So I think that's really what's not known, the molecular mechanisms by which bone loss and muscle loss are both happening. So we know at a physiological level what's happening. We can see it, we can take images of it, and we know that bone mass, especially trabecular bone mass, is decreasing, not so much cortical bone mass. But what we don't know is how and why. And if we can figure that out, then possibly we can combine exercise with a pharmaceutical target. That would be like the holy grail, I would say. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more thought process into what researchers are looking at and why they're looking at it.
You think NASA has particular preferences between exercise versus pharmacologic-based countermeasures?
No, I don't know that. I think I would say it's such a big problem. They're open to all. Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And then in terms of like preconditioning, astronauts are generally like very healthy people.
Yeah.
Do you think there's a certain amount of fitness where, NASA is sort of like, this is fit enough, or are they the type of people to be like running marathons, doing triathlons, or is like healthy person generally considered okay? How does that look?
That's a really good question. I don't know if there's any metrics of healthy enough or fit enough to get into space. Like if that's part of their checklist, when I trained astronauts, we had to actually sign a form that said this astronaut has completed the requirements of the training for whatever system and can go into space. I don't know if there is one from the folks who do the training and the health and fitness part of it. I will say that they are the only group I believe at NASA that can use actual work time towards working out and going to the gym. So that alone right there, just, I think you can very safely say that they're always fit. I mean, they're always fit, even in their times where they're in between missions, because let's be real, they don't get on missions that often. The missions are few and far between right now. They've increased in cadence once we got SpaceX to be able to take astronauts to and from. And they were really few and far between prior to that. But they're in some regular cadence now. But even then, even in between missions, they're just a fit group of people. I will say they are also, going back to your previous question about hobbies and things that you like to do. I mean, if you don't like to exercise, you're gonna have a hard time as an astronaut. Uh, so definitely, if that's something that you just enjoy, like you like going for a run, it doesn't mean you need to be a marathoner, but do you enjoy doing CrossFit? Do you enjoy lifting? Do you enjoy just being healthy and fit and keeping yourself conditioned? That I would definitely say, while there are no actual health prerequisites for astronaut, like to me, that would be a health prerequisite. Like you will be miserable if you don't have an interest in that, because they are a very fit group and they do take their fitness very seriously for good reason, right? If you are preconditioned and you go into space, you're less likely to have issues.
Absolutely. Well, we're running up on time here. If anybody has any final questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, thank you all so much for being here on a weekday in the middle of the day. Thank you to you as well, Mamta, for speaking with us all. I'm sure this is very, very
Of
informative
course.
for our student members, and we're so excited to have hosted you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for all of the awesome questions and your comments throughout. Thank you.
All right. If no one else has any questions, then I think we'll sign off. Thank you again,
Oh,
everyone.
before everyone goes, I just want to let you know that if you're in the Boston area and you're a student, we have a conference coming up at the end of July, the ISSRDC. I'm going to put the screen up in just a second. It is from July 29th to August 1st, but August 1st, you would have the opportunity to attend as a student. We're trying to get as many students in as possible. I'm going to go ahead and put that slide up. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Again, that's July 29th through August 1st, 2024. I'll put my email in the chat, and we're so glad that you joined us today. So thank you so very much.
Sorry, yes, thank you. R&D conference will be in Boston. Stop by if you're interested. I am also in Boston, so feel free to shoot me a message. Would love to grab coffee or chat with any of you guys.
And there's my email if anyone has any questions about that. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we're proud to partner with ASGSR for this student webinar series.
Perfect. Thank you, Anna. Thank you to the IS.
Thank you, Mamta.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.